It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast. My guest today is Timmy Håman. We're going to talk about two items. One is exposure to cold, to help increase your brown fat, cold therapy. And he also has a new kind of therapy that helps athletic performance, called pump therapy, we're going to talk about as well. But we'll start with the hot and the cold. So welcome, Timmy. Thank you.
Hi, Richard. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Really excited to be on here and talk about the benefits of cold and also the palm cooling concepts.
Okay, well, yeah, let's start with a little bit about your background. How did you get into cold therapy and, your current position where you're at today?
Yeah, so originally I'm from Sweden, and when I was young, I started working out like a lot of people did. We actually played a sport called handball for a fair bit, and it's kind of a physical sport. So
it's like racquetball, I guess. You run and you smack the ball against the wall, and then the other person has to smack it.
Well, I would say it's more like a combination of basketball to one extent, football and American football. Or when I say football, I mean, obviously I'm European, so I'm referring to soccer. You have a goalkeeper, and you're trying to score behind the goalkeeper, and it has a bit of the physicality from American football. But you, as the kind of name mentions, you use your hands instead of your feet.
Okay.
And yeah, the reason why I'm bringing that up is that that kind of sent me to the gym around the age of 16, and at the age of 19, 20, I kind of stopped working out for a bit. And a little bit later than that, I ended up working on cruise ships. And I mean, that was fantastic. A lot of fun, as I think a lot of people can imagine. But in the end of the day, I lived in the buffet of a cruise ship for like over a year. And when I came back from that, let's say my fitness levels weren't really what I wanted them to be. I looked at myself in the mirror, I was 24, and I was just like, you know what? This can't really continue. Like, I don't want to be like this, and I don't want to, like, the trajectory was just really, really bad. And I was like, I got to do something about this. So I started working out again and got back into the gym, which I did enjoy from previous years. So I did that for a while, made good progress in the beginning, but didn't really reach to where I really wanted to be. And I kept on reading more, and I studied engineering at university. So, I kind of have a scientific mind, and I like to understand more and so forth. So I read more and more. And after a while, a couple of years ago, I started getting into and then hearing, as I think a fair amount of people have done, like about the benefits of cold and how cold has a range of benefits, both from our mental and physical part, but also from a pure fat burning perspective, that it has actually huge benefits. And there is something called brown fat, something that I realized after a while there, which is completely different. I don't know, have you ever spoken about brown fat with your listeners before?
I haven't covered it on the podcast, but I know that people that are exposed to cold and, younger people have more brown fat. It's supposed to be a healthier form of fat. I guess Eskimos probably would have a very high percentage of it compared to most people because, the living conditions they're in. But yeah, I haven't covered much, but go ahead and explain.
Yeah, so brown fat is different from normal fat because normal fat, or white fat as we kind of call it, is just storage of energy. But brown fat has the ability to create heat. And it does that because it has mitochondria in it. And that is also what creates the brownness of it. And the mitochondria, because it's not a muscle where the muscle can create tension and heat, or contraction rather than tension, because it doesn't have that capability. It can only create heat. And it kind of acts a bit like the body's thermostat, you could say, or boiler in your house to one extent. And it can really, really heat you up. And toddlers have a lot, or toddlers or completely newborn babies have actually a lot of brown fat because they cannot shiver. Their nervous systems isn't really developed in that way, and their muscular system isn't really developed enough to be able to do that. So they instead have a very high amount of brown fat to keep them warm if they get cold. So all humans have this when we are born, and then we have a tendency to lose this continuously throughout our life. And actually researchers didn't think that adults had brown fat until maybe 15, 20 years ago. They thought we completely lost this, but actually they realized, and then this kind of came out of CT scans and stuff they did for cancers, because sometimes they saw on these scans that it seemed like people had cancers, because what these scans do is they look for areas that require a lot of energy. And so it looked like people had cancers in kind of specific places and so forth. And I'm like, this is really strange. But then they realized that there's actually brown fat that is activated to keep the person warm.
So, okay, how does, what's the interplay between white fat and brown fat? So, when you're in a cold situation, what do both do? And in the presence or absence of each other, what do they do differently?
So you could say that they don't kind of like interact with each other. I would say that the white fat is just purely energy storage for when we need extra energy, whereas the brown fat activates by when you're cold to keep you warm. And the colder you are, the more brown fat you can actually kind of accumulate. And if you think about it, like, so if I take myself as an example, like I'm from Sweden, people lived in Sweden 200 years ago. There was no central heating. There was no central heating, and people were outside for a majority of the year. And it could be 30 below Celsius or basically 100 or over 0 Fahrenheit. And people survived that. We are actually made to live in those kind of climates much more than we think today, but we have kind of lost the ability to do that because we don't expose ourselves. It's the brown fat that makes us able, or made those people able, to live in those conditions. And it's kind of like this internal thermostat. As long as you keep it active, like they did because they didn't really have an option, you will be able to live in those type of conditions. So, and the more you expose yourself to cold, the more brown fat you will maintain from when you were young. And also you can actually kind of brown or beiging fat by exposing yourself to more cold. You can accumulate more of it by that exposure. And this is super interesting from a pure weight loss perspective because it's highly, highly metabolic. So the more brown fat you have, the more calories you burn in rest. And also, as soon as you're exposed to cold slightly, you will have this kind of like internal fire to help you burn more calories. And there is a range of studies that's done on this. And the more brown fat you have, the lower your blood sugar levels in general. And also on average, the lower your BMI is. And one of the most interesting studies that I think that is ever done, it's a fairly small one in terms of the number of participants, but they did a study where they had 3 different groups of women. One that was constitutionally lean, which means that they could not gain weight. And they had one that was more anorectic. They were very thin, but they just ate little. And they had a group of normal weight women. And they realized that out of these ones, the only ones who had active brown fat at room temperature, meaning that other people generally needs lower temperature to activate the brown fat. The only group that had active brown fat at room temperature was the women who could not gain weight. Basically, this, as soon as they were in room temperature, their brown fat was activated, and as it's so highly metabolical, they couldn't gain weight. So it seems like this is one of the core reasons for those individuals who simply like, they just eat what they want. Whatever they eat, they never gain weight.
Yeah.
They normally have brown fat active at room temperature.
What's the average percentage of brown fat that people have, whether they're athletes or not, whether they do cold exposure versus not, like men versus women, and how high do the levels go in people that are actively cold exposed?
That's a good question. From a percentage perspective, I don't really know. I do know that it's very low. Like it's a very small part of when you look at CT scans, like you see a couple of places in the body of people wear these, and it's generally around the kind of spine area and up the neck area, but it can be across the entire body. But we're talking like maybe 1% or something like that of the total 2-3% or something like that. Single digits for sure of the fat that is active or that is brown fat. A great majority of everybody's fat is still going to be white fat.
Okay. So what are the protocols that seem to increase brown fat in someone? What can someone do? Has anyone tested different protocols to increase brown fat?
So generally, the key thing to maintain brown fat is cold exposure, either in water or in air. If you do in water, it has a significantly higher impact just because the water transfers heat so much better than air. Air is a very strong insulator for heat transfer, whereas water transfers heat very well. So that's the number one way to improve your brown fat. There is also a couple of things you can eat, like red peppers and spicy things help. Curcumin, so the active ingredient in turmeric, helps, and also omega-3. Those are kind of three things that can help you increase your amount of brown fat and the activation of the brown fat. It's also good to work out. It has shown to have an impact of there is a correlation between good physical performance and brown fat. Obviously, that one can kind of go in both ways to one extent, but generally working out helps the activation of the brown fat as well. So these are kind of like the three main ways to help you increase your amount of brown fat.
What about hot and cold cycling instead of just cold exposure? You go like 10 minutes sauna, 10 minutes cold pool, back and forth. Has anyone looked at that for brown fat formation?
As far as I'm aware, there isn't any research done on that in direct correlation to brown fat, but it could be that I haven't seen that research. But I'm not aware of that being a specific benefit of the kind of like cycling that seems to be good for other recovery reasons and so forth. It doesn't say it's not beneficial in that perspective, but definite. But I don't know for sure that it helps.
So if someone increases their cold exposure and they do the protocol properly and they increase their brown fat, what will they notice? Will they feel less cold, in cold situations? Will they be more alert? Will they be more mentally clear? Like, what are the side effects, you could say?
Well, they would definitely feel less cold. They would be more resistant to cold. That's one for sure. And I mean, it's hard to kind of say. It's a little bit like if you gain a bit of muscle, you will increase your metabolic rate. Will you notice if you gain 3 kilos of muscle in terms of you can suddenly eat significantly more? Probably not. So I'm not sure that you will kind of, physically feel an increase in your metabolic rate, but for sure you will be able to withstand cold significantly better and without as much kind of feeling it as much. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the other therapy that you've come up with. I didn't know if I heard it right. It's palm therapy. Can you spell it? And then we'll talk about what it involves.
Yeah, sure. So that's palm cooling. And basically, it's a very, very fascinating protocol to help you supercharge your exercise performance. And I first heard about this on the Uberman Lab podcast. He did an episode about it. And when it comes to exercise things, I always looking to find an edge and improvement and stuff. But often when you hear things, they talk about, if you do this and this and this, and you jump through a lot of hoops and you get like a 7% increase. And I'm like, I'm a recreational athlete in the end of the day. Like, I don't want to do loads of things and then maybe get a couple of percentage extra here and there. When I listened to this podcast originally, like what really struck me with this was that like some of the studies and the results they've gotten were absolutely phenomenal. So the first thing, one of the key studies they've done on this was when they had a group of trained individuals, so like not newbies, they did pull-ups. They did a fair amount of sets. They did 10 sets, so it's a kind of high volume in that sense. But they did a baseline workout session, and then they did with palm cooling, which is, just to kind of go back to what it is, like it is basically cooling the palms of your hands between workout sets. And it's more advanced than that, actually.
The whole hand or just the palms?
Just the palms of the hands. I can get to exactly why in a couple of minutes, but go through the kind of benefits of it first. And they did these twice a week for 6 weeks, and they increased the amount of pull-ups they could do 144% in 6 weeks.
Why?
Yeah, that's like insane gains. I mean, they did fairly high volume and stuff, but like that was just like, wow. And another really interesting stat that another trial or study they've done, they had trained individuals doing bench presses, and they had an average of, I think, 7 or 8 years of lifting experience. Experienced lifters, they came back, they did a baseline, came back a couple of days later, like 6 days later, did palm cooling, and they increased the total amount they lifted by 26% in just a couple of days. Like insane. There is another one which this came out of a lab at Stanford University, a guy called Craig Heller. And because with Stanford, obviously, they have a good football program, etc. So a couple of the people that went to their football program heard about this. So they had a guy called Greg Clark who played tight end for San Francisco 49ers. And he came in and was like, I really want to try this. And they asked him, what do you do well? And he's like, I do a lot of dips. I do that well. So they had him do dips and he chunked out 40 the first set and then like he dropped down. So after 5 sets, he was done. But he done a total of, I think, 103 reps. And then they had him back 4 days later. And then he did basically the same first. And then the second set, he cooled the palms of his hands between sets. Second set, he could do 8 more than last time around. And he kept on doing more. So after the 5 sets, he had done 33 more reps. So 31% increase in just a couple of days for an NFL player in peak condition.
Well, what does the palm pulling look like, though? I don't understand. If I do a dip, what do? I put my hands on ice? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on exactly which kind of mechanism you're using. But the way you should cool the palms of your hands is that it shouldn't be like an ice thing because that's too cold. It causes vasoconstriction. So what you're aiming for is about 15, 16 degrees Celsius, so about 45 Fahrenheit. Because if you cool more than that, it was called vasoconstriction. So it will be kind of counterproductive. So you're trying to aim for that way or that temperature. The best way to do it is to have something kind of metal-based that has that temperature and maintains that temperature. In the scientific studies they've done, they had like a specific glove and they developed a product for that, but it's actually $1,500 for one hand, and you'd ideally need for both hands. And that's why I created a product for this, to make it more affordable and easier to use. So what we're using is just like a metal tube, where we put water in, and then I have ice sticks to make sure that you maintain the right kind of temperature throughout the workout. But you can technically do it. Like when I started trying this out, before I developed the product, I actually sat with my hands in a water bucket and just put ice in it to maintain the right temperature. It's a bit convoluted, but it worked.
Why do you think it works? Well, first of all, what do you experience when you do it? Like, what do you feel like when you're lifting a weight? And, I do a set on the bench, let's say, then I cool my palms, however the best method is, and then I go to do another set. But how do I feel different?
So you will feel less fatigued. You will feel you have a bit more energy. So the mechanism around this is that, like, our body is very afraid of overheating, because if we overheat, we can die. And as soon as our body temperature goes up a bit, we live in a fairly narrow spectrum in the end of the day. We're talking Fahrenheit, we're at 98.5, 99 degrees on average. And if we reach 106, where we need to go to hospital. It's a fairly narrow spectrum. And when we work out, we increase the metabolic rate in the muscle up to 50, 60 times. And over that, 80% is heat. So we generate a lot of heat when we work out. That's why we start sweating. But because we generate so much heat, that's dangerous for our body. So in our muscle, there is an enzyme called pyruvate kinase that helps produce the ATP. And this enzyme is heat sensitive to ensure that we don't overheat and push ourselves too far. So as soon as the temperature in our muscle and body goes up, the ATP production is being reduced.
What you're doing is you're making the body think it's still in a safe zone, so therefore it allows the person to lift more and it gives more to them instead of conserving it.
Actually, you're not kind of tricking the body to this. What you are doing is you're cooling it down. So it's kind of like you're not circumventing the safety mechanism. You're cooling the body. And the reason why we're using the palms of our hands is that the palms of our hands and also the bottom of our feet and the part of the face above the bedline has specific blood vessels called avas, a very complicated name, but it's also called glabrous skin. And that means that we don't have hair follicles there. That means that we have different type of blood vessels that are much tighter and they go straight to our heart, instead of through very thin capillaries, etc. So if you want to cool down and heat up your body, these 3 surfaces is the most effective way to do it. It's much more effective than any other thing. A lot of people think that you should kind of try to put it on your neck or the wrist of your hand and so on, but that is not.
All right, the carotid arteries run through the neck. So, I used to work in a flea market. It was hot and I had a necktie filled with liquid crystals and you put it in water, soak it in ice water and it would keep you cold. But because the carotid arteries run by the the cold source, it kept you pretty cool. So that's like, why not put a cold can of soda against your carotid artery, on either side, and try it that way instead of your palm?
So they've actually done in the lab, Craig Heller's lab at Stanford, they've done comparisons where how quickly you cool down your body by cooling the palms or some of these specific areas, and the palms cool down at least twice as fast as the kind of general thing, the neck and so forth. So it's a much more effective way to cool down your body, these surfaces.
So if I had a cold plate and I went on like hands and feet, if I bare hands, bare feet, and I like on all fours like a dog, and I sat there on this really cold plate for like a minute, do you think that would be incredibly fast cooling?
It will be, the challenge would be that the way you do it there is that you would have so much pressure, so you're also causing vasoconstriction. And like if you would sit on a chair and have something cooled on the bottoms of your feet and something that cools the palms of your hand that you can hold with a fairly neutral grip, because if you make the grip too tight, you also cause vasoconstriction. So it needs to be kind of the right type of pressure, if you see what I mean.
Okay, so you found that this is faster cooling than putting stuff around your neck near the carotid arteries, for instance.
Yeah, obviously, like these are not attempts I've done myself. This is things they've done in Craig Heller's lab, but it seems to be the thing, or it seems to be very efficient. What I find interesting about this as well is that actually your body heat impacts how you feel. If you think about it, if it's like 30 degrees Celsius or like 80, 90 Fahrenheit, like you're out by a beach, it's really warm outside, you would just kind of feel like you don't want to do much.
I felt that in the summer, you're just like, oh, you don't want to do anything.
Exactly. And this is the body's way telling you that, buddy, don't go run a marathon because it's warm outside. If you run a marathon now, you are going to overheat very easily. If you feel like that, if you jump in a pool, right away you wake up. You have so much more energy because the body realized, oh, I don't need to be worried about overheating. So the heating actually impacts how fatigued you feel. The warmer you are, the more fatigued you feel, even though your muscles and your body might not be as fatigued as you feel. So when you cool down, when you work out, you're also going to feel like you have more energy. It makes a huge difference.
Okay, so what, people can lift 30, 40% more, or do they have more endurance? Like, does it help with explosive strength or endurance, or, what kind of effects does it have? Is it a rising tide that lifts all boats? Like, no matter what physical activity you do, if you do periodic palm cooling, you can do it better?
Yeah, I would say generally anything you do, you can do it better if your body is cooler, and palm cooling is the most effective way of doing it. As an example, like I had a guy I'm not a runner myself, I go and lift weights, but I gave one of our palm cooling devices, peak performance bar, to a guy at the gym, and he was running on the treadmill, and he brought his heart rate up to 175, and then he put his hand holding the palm cooling device for 1 minute, and his heart rate just dropped to 155 with the same pace. And then he removed his hand, the heart rate went up again. And when he put his hand on it again, the heart rate went down. They did this a couple of times. And when he kind of finished his workout, and he also, when he was kind of like recovering, normally his heart rate drops by 20 beats per 30 seconds. Now it dropped by 40 beats per 30 seconds. So it's doubled the recovery pace of his heart rate.
So what if Mike Tyson put these in his gloves and he did his upcoming match? He would probably do really, really well, sounds like.
Yeah, probably would. There is some technicality challenges. How long would it keep cool in the palms of in his gloves? But yes, like if you would come up with a way to cool a boxer or an MMA fighter or something like that between rounds with this, where obviously they're wearing gloves. They could maybe do with it if they're not wearing footwear, that type of MMA fighter. But cooling between rounds for that type of, like, they will have so much more energy. Like, it's going to be a world of a difference for them, for sure. It really makes a huge impact. Another interesting thing where the mechanism isn't really clear yet is that it does decrease delayed onset muscle soreness a lot. So if we go back to the example with the NFL player, like he did 30% more repetitions with the same amount of sets. He actually then continued and could do 4 more sets. So his total workload increased by almost 100% in the one session. And you think, like, when you increase the workload that much, you'd be like, and he said that, like, I'm going to be sore tomorrow. Didn't feel a thing. So they haven't really figured out the mechanism why it does decrease delayed onset muscle soreness. But yeah, it seems to speed up recovery so much. Like when I go to the gym these days, like I'm never sore. It doesn't matter what I do. I don't get that anymore. And I'm 43, so I'm not no spring chicken anymore. Like I'd expect to feel much more. So I really think that in 10 years' time, people are going to look at body temperature as important in any kind of workout stuff as they do sleep and nutrition today. It's an area which I think research has completely missed somehow. I'm not really sure why, but in 10 years' time, I think everybody's going to talk about temperature and body temperature and how it impacts physical performance, because it makes a huge difference.
So is this become a standard protocol for certain athletes? Like, how widespread is this knowledge, or is it very new and very niche so far?
I would say the thing is that it's not very new. The first studies that did on it was 2010, 2013, but it hasn't spread yet. A little bit one of the reasons why I want to go on podcasts like yours to kind of make people aware, because I think it's a fantastic protocol. Like, it's super interesting and has huge impact. But from my understanding, it has started spreading a bit more through Craig Heller's lab in Stanford, and a couple of people they're connected with, but their device is very expensive. So I think that limits the adaptation from it. But yeah, it seems to spread a bit, at least in the kind of top athlete area.
Okay. Is there any more refinements to the protocol that need to be done? Specific devices, maybe inserts in gloves or things like that, or just inserts that you could hold? Then where is this going?
Well, I think it's going there is products, like, as I said, I have developed the Peak Performance Bar, which is a device you can bring to the gym. I'm looking at making it more as mobile as possible. It's looking at kind of ways that you can bring it with you on a run and things like that without maybe you need to have it in your hand the entire time, etc. So there is development going on. I'm looking at as many ways as possible to kind of get this to people. And then there is a couple of products if people Google palm cooling device. So there is a few, but it's not a range of them yet. But I think in a couple of years, we're going to have significantly more of that for sure.
Are there any downsides to using it? Have you seen, or no? Can someone overextend themselves because they're using it when they normally couldn't push themselves that hard, therefore hurt themselves?
I mean, obviously, there could always be a thing if someone push themselves too hard, and there is a risk of injury in that sense, but nothing more than, nothing extreme or nothing more. I haven't seen any higher rate of injury or anything like that, if you see what I mean. It's
nice. There's no surgery, none of that stuff. And it sounds like it's very beneficial. That's great.
Yeah. And what I think is really interesting here as well is that actually it's the improvements are conditioning. So they actually did another thing where they had another NFL player in, and he was doing, I think it was bench press he was doing, and they did palm cooling for 2 weeks, and then he increased a fair bit, and then they didn't palm cool for 2 weeks, and he kind of maintained the performance because he had worked out at a higher level for a bit. So even without the palm cooling, he was just a little bit below that. And so if you kind of use palm cooling for a bit and you improve your performance with that, you will maintain that. And if you then add palm cooling further on, you can improve further, like they did with that NFL player. It's a very interesting graph that you see first 2 weeks in good improvement, then flat for 2 weeks, and then further good improvement for 2 weeks.
Have you tried hand warmers to see if it makes it worse for people, just to try?
So I haven't done that. I know there is some studies that have done that, and they saw no improvement with hand warming in that sense.
Well, I wouldn't expect them to see an improvement. I would expect to see a detriment if the theory holds, maybe.
Okay, yeah, actually warming, I think they've only done it with neutral temperature, so to speak. So I don't think there is any with direct warming as far from the studies that I have seen on it.
Oh, I see. Yeah. When you first said palm cooling, I imagined someone with a big palm frond fanning somebody instead of what you discussed. But I know it's not that, but that's what I pictured first in my mind. Yeah. Someone being fanned by big palm frond.
Yeah, no, it's the best way to kind of do it is if you hold something of metal that has that temperature, that has a water part on the other side of it, because that transfers the heat the best way. I mean, a fan would help as well. It's better than nothing, to be direct.
Okay, I understand. Well, very good. Very good, Tim. What's the best place for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
Yeah, if you want to find out more about palm cooling and brown fat, go and look at our Instagram. It's Prime Science Health, just the 3 words, Prime Science Health. And also you can go to our website, which is primescience.co.uk, or you just put in Google Prime Science and you'll find our products. And we're happy to share a lot of knowledge about the benefits of brown fat and palm cooling. And if you want to know something more specific, just go there and send us a DM, send me an email. I can talk about this until the cows come home. I love it. So yeah, want to know more. So,
Well, Timmy, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you being here.
thank you very much for having me, Richard. That's great being here, and thank you.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about the Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.